The sound was not a roar or even a rush, but a quiet, insistent gulping. It was the sound of cracked earth drinking. Elara stood beside the muddy wound in her field, the hem of her dress soaked, her hands raw and aching, a pool of water impossibly clear beneath the churned clay, widened by the second. Her sheep, the 40 skeletal fools she'd bought for a song, crowded close, their heads bowed not in defeat but in reverence. They drank. Around them, beyond the sagging wire of her fence, the town of Providence watched. Their faces, etched with the dust and despair of a 2-month drought, were a gallery of disbelief. They had come to see the final, pitiful end of the woman who'd bought a boneyard flock and a dead field. They found a miracle instead. Then a horse cut through the silent crowd. Silas Croft, the county water commissioner, dismounted with a stiff, proprietary air. He smoothed his vest and walked toward her, his boots making no sound on the parched ground, until he reached the damp perimeter of the spring. He did not look at her, but at the water. His eyes narrowed with the cold arithmetic of power. "An unregistered spring," he said, his voice smooth as a polished stone. "All such sources fall under the county charter, for the public good, of course." He finally met her gaze, a flicker of condescending pity in his eyes. "A young woman alone could never manage a thing like this." It was the same tone he'd used 6 months ago, the same tone the whole town had used. 6 months earlier, Elara had stood in the dust of the same auction yard, a stranger in a town that prided itself on knowing every soul from birth to burial. She had inherited the quarter section from a great-uncle she'd never met, a patch of land the locals called the Scrabble, because only a fool would try to scratch a living from it. It was baked clay in the summer, a slick of mud in the winter, and grew nothing but thistle and bitterweed. The auctioneer was finishing up for the day, trying to offload the last lot. 40 head of sheep from a foreclosed ranch up north. They were a miserable sight, their wool matted and thin, their ribs like washboards under their hides. They huddled together, a mass of trembling bones, their pale eyes vacant with hunger. "What am I bid for this fine flock?" the auctioneer bellowed, a joke in his voice. A ripple of laughter went through the assembled ranchers. $2 for the lot," someone shouted. "I'll give you 3 for the hides," another called back. Elara watched them. She saw not a flock, but a collection of individual sorrows. She saw the way one ewe, the oldest, kept her body between the others and the mocking crowd. She saw the faint, unusual curve of their noses, the sturdy set of their legs beneath the starved frames. They were not the common breed of the valley. She raised a hand. $12, she said, her voice quiet but clear in the sudden lull. Every head turned. Fletcher, the man who ran the general store, leaned toward his neighbor. "That's the girl who took the old Miller place. Got more nerve than sense." Silas Croft, standing near the front, simply smiled a small, pitying smile. The auctioneer, stunned, pointed his gavel at her. "Sold. To the lady with the $12 and the stomach for lost causes." Getting them home was a slow, pathetic procession. The 3 miles to her land took the rest of the day, the sheep stumbling, their breath coming in shallow rasps. They were too weak to rustle, too tired to resist. She moved behind them, herding them with gentle words, a ghost driving ghosts. The land, when they arrived, was no comfort. The cabin was little more than a box against the wind, and the field was a flat expanse of gray-brown clay, fractured into 1,000 pieces by the sun. There was a well near the cabin with a low, grudging supply of brackish water, and a single shallow basin at the far end of the property, where rainwater sometimes gathered before the sun baked it away. It was there she led them. For 2 days they did not move. They lay in the meager shade of the fence posts, their sides barely rising and falling. Elara hauled bucket after bucket of water from her well, setting the pans before their noses, crumbling the last of her own oats into the water to give them strength. She sat with them through the long, cool nights, a solitary guardian for a flock no one else wanted. On the third morning, a small boy appeared at her fence line. He was perhaps 10 years old, with hair the color of straw and eyes that missed nothing. It was Leo, the youngest son of her nearest neighbor, a proud, frightened man named Thorn who had warned her she'd starve before the first snow. The boy didn't speak, just watched. He watched her coax a weak lamb to its feet. He watched her clean the matted wool around a ew's eyes. Finally, he pointed a thin finger. "That one," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "He looks like a Gus." Elara looked at the old ram, whose horns curled in a weary spiral. He did look like a Gus. "All right," she said. "He's Gus." And so it began. The boy came every day, and day by day he named the flock. There was Pip and Willow and Stone, and 40 names for 40 souls. It was the first kindness she'd been shown, and it came from a silent child who saw not a lost cause, but a family. By the second week, the sheep began to live. Their heads lifted. They began to graze, tearing at the stubborn bitterweed with an unnerving focus. And they began to dig. It started with Gus. Elara found him in the dry basin, not grazing, but pawing at the hardest patch of clay, his hoofs striking the ground with a dull, rhythmic thud. Soon others joined him. They would scrape and paw for an hour, then rest, then begin again. And it was a strange, unsettling behavior. The mockery from the town, which had been a low hum, grew louder. Fletcher, the store owner, would ask her what she planned to do with her ditch-digging sheep when she came in for flour and salt. "Training them to find their own graves, are you?" He'd chuckle to the other men by the stove. "Saves on the shovel work." She never replied. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not yet right. She would simply gather her supplies, pay what was asked, and walk back out into the silence. The arithmetic of survival was a constant prayer she recited in the dark. $12 for the sheep, 50 cents a week for grain to supplement the weeds. Her own savings were a small, shrinking pile of coins in a jar. The sheep had to provide, but they were still too thin for shearing, too weak for butchering. Their only work was this strange, obsessive digging in the basin, a patch of ground everyone knew was as dead as the moon. One afternoon, Silas Croft rode out himself. He reined his glossy bay horse to a stop at her fence, looking down at her from his elevated height. "Miss Thorne," he began, not bothering to get her name right, "I've come to make a neighborly offer. This land, it's a burden. I'd be willing to take it off your hands, pay you a fair price, enough to get you a fresh start somewhere more hospitable." He gestured at the field, at the sheep kicking up dust in the basin. "Someone alone, a woman, has no business trying to tame a place like this. It's no place for you." She looked at his clean hands, his polished boots. She looked at her own, the nails broken, the palms layered with calluses. "It is my place, Mr. Croft," she said, "and I am not selling." He smiled, that pitying smile again, the one that said he knew better. "The offer stands," he said, turning his horse. "It will still be there when you're ready to accept the inevitable." Her only other regular visitor, besides Leo, was Anya Petrova. Mrs. Petrova lived 2 miles down the road, on a small farmstead that bloomed with color. She was a woman made of earth and patience, with eyes that held the memory of a different, harder land across the sea. She did not offer advice or pity. She brought a loaf of dark, heavy bread one day, a jar of pickled beets the next. She would sit with Elara on the cabin steps and watch the sheep. For weeks she said nothing about their strange habit. She just watched, her hands resting in her lap, still and knowing. One hot afternoon, as the sun beat down and the sheep dug with a kind of desperate energy, Mrs. Petrova finally spoke. "In my country," she said, her voice a low rumble, accented and warm, "there are places the water goes to hide. It sleeps deep in the ground, where the sun cannot steal it." She nodded toward the basin where Gus was now using his horns to pry at a half-buried rock. "The land does not forget water. It only waits for the right question." Elara looked from the old woman to the determined sheep. What question are they asking? Mrs. Petrova smiled, a slow spreading of wrinkles. "They ask where it is gone. This breed, they are not from here. They are from the dry hills, from a place where you follow the memory of water, or you die. They are not digging for graves, little bird. They are digging for life." A new kind of arithmetic began in Elara's head that night, not of money and flour, but of instinct and hope. The next morning she took a pickaxe and a shovel and walked to the basin. When Leo arrived, he found her working alongside the sheep, prying out the same rocks Gus had loosened, clearing the hard-packed clay the ewes had scraped away. He didn't ask why. He simply picked up a flat stone and began to scrape with her. They worked in the heat of the day, a woman, a boy, and 40 starving sheep, a secret conspiracy of faith. They were clearing a path. They were helping the flock ask their question more clearly. The hole grew day by day. It was not a well, just a wide, shallow depression, but it was the focus of all their labor. They kept their work hidden, a coal banked low under ash. When riders passed on the main road, Elara and Leo would move away from the basin, pretending to mend the fence or clear thistle, their hearts beating a little faster until the sound of hoofbeats faded. By June, the sky had become a sheet of hammered brass. The rains, which should have come in May, never arrived. The creek that bisected the valley, the source of life for every other farm and ranch, began to shrink. The lush green along its banks faded to a sickly yellow-brown. The ranchers watched the sky, their faces tight with a worry Elara knew well, though hers was for a different reason. Her own well was down to a few feet of sludge, enough for her and the flock for now, but not forever. The sheep seemed to feel the growing thirst of the land around them. Their digging took on a new urgency. The shallow depression was now 3 feet deep in the center, a wide bowl of excavated clay and stone, and at the bottom the earth was cool to the touch. In the mornings, before the sun rose high enough to burn it away, a faint dampness darkened the soil at the very bottom. It was not water, not yet, but it was a promise. That month, a traveling wool merchant, a man named Elias Reed, stopped his wagon at her gate. He had heard the jokes in town about her flock and was curious. He was a small, neat man with hands that understood texture better than words. He walked out to the flock, his expression skeptical. The sheep were still thin, their coats ragged from the poor spring season. "Not much of a shearing here, miss," he said, not unkindly. "I'm not selling wool," Elara said. "Not yet." But Gus, ever the patriarch, rubbed against a fence post, leaving a tuft of wool snagged on a nail. Reed, out of habit, reached out and plucked it free. He rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. He stopped. He brought it closer to his eyes. He did it again. The wool from her sheep, nourished on some combination of bitterweed and stubborn hope, was not coarse and brittle as it should have been. It was strangely fine, with a deep, springy crimp and an astonishing strength. It was the wool of a mountain breed, tough and resilient. "Where did you get this flock?" he asked, his voice changed, all business now. "They were for sale," she said simply. He looked from the tuft of wool to the ragged flock, then back again. a slow understanding dawning in his eyes. He bought the contents of her shearing bag, a paltry collection of scraps and tufts she'd gathered, for $3. It was more than a quarter of what she'd paid for the entire flock. It was enough for 2 months of flour, a new handle for her pickaxe, and a small, fierce kernel of proof. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek slowed to a crawl, then a series of stagnant pools, then nothing but a cracked gray scar running through the valley. The great herds of cattle, the pride of the ranchers who had laughed at Elara, stood gaunt and lowing by the dry banks, their tongues thick with thirst. Silas Croft, whose own ranch was upstream and who had a deep, reliable well, became the most powerful man in Providence. He established a water wagon, selling barrels from his own supply at prices that felt like theft. $1 a barrel, then 2, then 5. Men who had been proud landowners now stood in line, hats in hand, their pockets emptying for the one thing they could not live without. Wagons loaded with families and their meager possessions began to trail out of the valley, heading west, defeated. The town grew quiet, the air thick with the dust of failure and the tension of fear. On Elara's land, the world had shrunk to the bowl in the earth. The damp patch at the bottom was now a patch of genuine mud. It never dried, not even at the height of the afternoon sun. The sheep no longer ranged over the property. They stayed near the hole, a silent, waiting vigil. Their digging was constant, a soft, percussive rhythm that was the only music on the dead-still air. Elara and Leo worked in the cooler hours of the morning and evening, hauling out bucket after bucket of clay. The hole was now deep enough that Leo could stand in it, and the top of his head would barely be visible. One evening, Thorne, Leo's father, came to her fence. His face was a mask of pride and desperation. "The boy," he said, his voice hoarse. "He spends too much time here. It's not right." "He's a good worker," Elara said, not looking up from the bucket she was emptying. "He's chasing a fantasy, digging in a dustbin. Same as you." He kicked at the fence post. "Croft is charging $7 a barrel now. My well is dry. I'll have to sell my stock. Everything." He looked at her then, his eyes full of a helpless anger. "And you're out here playing in the dirt with your ghost sheep." He turned and stalked away, his fear so thick it was like a smell in the air. Elara watched him go, her heart aching for him, for all of them. But she did not stop. The mud was getting softer. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down, making the air shimmer. Elara's own well had finally given out, the bucket scraping bottom with a dry, hollow sound. She had 3 barrels of water left. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. It was not enough. The sheep knew it. They had worked all night, their bodies slick with sweat, their breathing harsh. They were no longer just pawing. They were stamping, all 40 of them, in a circle at the bottom of the pit, their hooves compacting the mud, their combined weight a tremendous, focused pressure. It was a dance of desperation, an ancient rite she did not understand, but respected completely. She and Leo stood at the edge, too tired to dig, and watched. The sun climbed higher. A hot, dry wind began to blow, lifting clouds of topsoil from the neighboring fields and sending it skittering across the scrabble. Croft chose that moment to return. He rode up slowly, the picture of calm authority in a world gone mad with thirst. "I heard your well went dry," he said, his voice laced with false sympathy. "My offer still stands, Miss Miller. I'll give you $50 for the land and the flock. More than generous. Enough to see you to a better place." She stared at him, her face smudged with dirt. her hair clinging to her neck. She felt a pure, cold anger rise in her. He was a vulture, circling what he thought was a corpse. "The price is not $50, she said. "There is no price." His smile tightened. "Pride is a luxury, my dear. You'll learn that soon enough." He turned to leave, but stopped. From the pit came a new sound, a wet, sucking pop. Gus, the old ram, had stomped his right foreleg down, and it had punched through the clay floor of the basin as if it were paper. He pulled it out with a schlooping sound, and in the hole his hoof had made, something dark and slick began to well up. Water. A collective sigh went through the flock. They fell still, their heads turned to the small, widening circle of black mud. A smell rose on the hot air, rich and loamy, the smell of life itself, the smell of wet earth. Elara slid down the side of the pit, Leo tumbling after her. They fell to their knees in the mud and dug with their bare hands, scooping away the soft, yielding clay. The trickle became a seep, the seep a steady, silent flow. They worked through the hottest part of the day, their hands bleeding, their bodies screaming with exhaustion. The sheep stood on the slope above them, a silent, patient audience, their thirst held in check by a wisdom older than memory. The small hole became a puddle, the puddle a pool. The water that filled it was not the brackish stuff of her old well. It was cool and sweet. By late afternoon, the pool was a yard across and a foot deep, and the water was rising faster than the thirsty ground could drink it. Elara sat back on her heels, covered in mud from head to toe, and laughed. It was a raw, cracked sound she didn't recognize as her own. Leo, his face a mask of mud with two shining eyes, grinned back at her. It had worked. All the mockery, all the labor, all the stubborn, foolish faith had been answered. The land had remembered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the first visitor arrived. It was Thorn, Leo's father, drawn by the sight of his son running home, shouting and waving his arms. He stood at the fence line, his face rigid with disbelief. He looked at the muddy pit, at the impossible, shimmering pool of water, at the 40 sheep now stepping carefully down the slope to drink. He said nothing. He simply stared, his jaw working as other figures began to appear on the road, drawn by the commotion. Soon a crowd had gathered. They were the same people who had laughed at the auction, the same men who had joked in Fletcher's store. Their faces were no longer mocking. They were filled with a desperate, fragile awe. And then, through the crowd, came Silas Croft. This was the moment from the beginning, the moment of the reckoning. He strode to the edge of the pit, his face a thundercloud. "An unregistered spring," he declared, pulling a sheaf of papers from his coat. "All such sources fall under the county charter." He didn't look at Elara. He was speaking to the town, to his power over them. "The county will manage this resource, for the public good." He finally turned to her, his voice dropping to its familiar, condescending tone. "A young woman alone could never manage a thing like this. We'll see you're compensated for your trouble." Elara slowly climbed out of the pit. She stood before him, before the town, not as a girl with a lost cause, but as the woman who had brought forth water from stone. She was no longer afraid of his words, of their judgment. The exhaustion had burned away everything but a core of pure, hard certainty. She looked past Croft at the faces in the crowd. She saw Mrs. Fletcher, her lips cracked and peeling. She saw the Thorne family huddled together, their eyes fixed on the water. She saw the ranchers who had lost everything. They were not a jury. They were her neighbors, and they were thirsty. "This water is not for the county," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying in the still evening air. and it is not for me alone." Croft scoffed. "The law is the law." "The law of thirst is older," she replied. She turned back to the crowd. "The price of water from Mr. Croft's well is $7 a barrel." A murmur of bitter agreement went through the people. "The price of water from this well is 25 cents, enough to buy lumber for a proper well house, and to pay Leo here to help me run it. The rest is for the work." A stunned silence fell. 25 cents was not a price. It was a gift. It was the cost of a dipper, not a barrel. Croft's face went pale, then purple with rage. "You can't do that. You'll undermine the entire water economy." "A thing is only worth what others will pay, Mr. Croft," she said, echoing the mocking words from the auction house. "And I think your price is too high." Someone in the crowd, a rancher she didn't know, let out a short, sharp laugh. The tension broke. Fletcher, the store owner, stepped forward. 25 cents, you say?" Elara nodded. "But there is one condition. The flock drinks first. Always." Croft, seeing his authority evaporate, made one last, desperate grab for it. "This is a fluke. A puddle. How did you even know to dig here? No one knew there was water on this worthless patch of land." His voice was sharp, accusatory. From the edge of the crowd, Mrs. Petrova spoke, her voice calm and strong. "Perhaps you should tell us, Mr. Croft. How did you know to try and buy this worthless land not once but twice, before the drought was even at its worst?" The question hung in the air. The crowd turned as one to look at the commissioner. They all knew he had access to the old geological surveys from the railroad, surveys no one else had ever seen. His face, caught in the last rays of the setting sun, was a perfect picture of guilt. He had known. He had been waiting for her to fail so he could buy the land and its secret for himself. He didn't answer. He simply turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, the silence of the town chasing him down the road. The next morning, a line formed at Elara's gate. It was not a line of supplicants, but of neighbors. They came with wagons and barrels, and they came with 25 cents in their hands. But they also came with other things. Fletcher brought a wagon load of seasoned lumber for the well house. Thorne, his pride replaced by a quiet gratitude, brought his tools and his skill as a carpenter. The women brought food, loaves of bread and pots of stew. Creating a feast around the muddy spring, they worked together, raising the walls of a sturdy structure around the well, digging the channels to fill troughs for the livestock. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the sound of mockery. The water was not a fluke. It flowed steadily, cool and endless, from some deep, generous place in the earth. Elara, with Leo at her side, oversaw the distribution, taking the coins and dropping them into a simple wooden box. Her first customer was Thorne. He stood before her, his eyes unable to meet hers. He held out his quarter. She looked at him and then pushed his hand away gently. "Neighbors don't charge neighbors for the first drink," she said. The well became the new heart of Providence. It was a place people gathered not just for water, but for news, for company, for hope. Elara's Scrabble was no longer a joke. It was the farm that had saved them. The green of the bitterweed around the well began to be replaced by a soft, vibrant carpet of clover, spreading outward from the source, a living map of the water's generosity. The flock, now sleek and strong, grazed peacefully. They no longer dug. Their work was done. Leo, who now walked with a new confidence, was their official shepherd. He knew every one of their names, their habits, their histories. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the purple sky, Elara stood with Mrs. Petrova on the porch of the small cabin, looking out at the transformed land. The lights of the town twinkled below, and the lowing of cattle, having drunk their fill, was a peaceful sound. The air was cool and clean. "He will not be back," Mrs. Petrova said, meaning Croft. "Shame is a powerful fence." Elara nodded, watching Gus lead the flock to their bedding ground near the well house. They were home. "You knew," Elara said softly. "All along, you knew there was water." The old woman placed a warm, dry hand on her arm. "I did not know. I only knew the land does not forget, and that a question asked with enough faith will always find its answer." Elara looked at the dark, spreading stain of life on her once dead field, at the quiet dignity of the animals who had taught her how to listen, and she finally understood. The water had been there all along, sleeping. It had just been waiting for someone patient enough and foolish enough to ask.